This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
Great Lives is a download from Radio 4. We hope you enjoy what you're about to hear. Dear Sir, I beg to introduce myself to you as a clerk of the Accounts Department of the Port Trust Office at Madras on a salary of only £20 per annum. I am now about 23 years of age. I have had no university education, but I have undergone the ordinary school course. After leaving school, I have been employing the spare time at my disposal to work at mathematics. I have not trodden through the conventional regular course which is followed in a university course, but I am striking out a new path for myself. I have made a special investigation of divergent series in general, and the results I get are termed by the local mathematicians as startling. That letter, dated 16th of January 1913, was written by our subject today, Srinivasa Ramanujan, to G.H. Hardy in Trinity College, Cambridge, and, as we'll hear, it was the beginning of an extraordinary partnership that has far-reaching consequences in mathematics and beyond. Choosing Ramanujan is the internationally renowned, award-winning choreographer Akram Khan, associate artist at Sadler's Wells and the Curve Theatre in Leicester, and who performed at the opening of the London Olympics. The world of maths, Akram, men shut away in dusty universities doing complicated calculations, seems like a million miles away from dance, movement and choreography. What made you pick Ramanujan?
Well, actually, Ramanujan was someone that my mother had mentioned when I was a child. And she constantly spoke about him because my mother's father, my grandfather, who I never met, was a bit of a genius in mathematics. He won 2 gold medals in India, and he created his own theories, which they still study today. And so the whole community that I grew up with, or that I came into the world knowing, the Bangladeshi community who moved to London, constantly looked at me as if perhaps
You're the next
I'm
mathematical
the
genius.
next mathematical genius, because it had obviously skipped my mother because she went into literature and she was very good at literature. And it's funny what it does to you when a whole community around you start to believe in something that is definitely not true, but at the time perhaps could be true. Because as a child I started to believe maybe I have some of my grandfather's talent. And by some miracle, because I was influenced so much by my mother and the stories that she told me about my grandfather, who was a big fan of Ramanujan. I kind of started to look for patterns in everything, in people's speeches, in the way people walked, in the way people sat, in their hair colour, their tone of the voice. But that was I was a child who was dreaming, basically.
Yes, but it's interesting that this search for patterns, I mean, perhaps that is how, if these things are remotely genetic, perhaps that is how it came through in you, the fascination with pattern as opposed to numbers. Because in a way, what you're doing is to do with pattern, isn't it? Isn't
Absolutely.
dance, isn't choreography?
It is, but you know what it's also to do with? It's to do with telling stories using those patterns. One of my great inspirations is Stravinsky, who used to evoke emotion, or who wanted to evoke emotion from an audience using particular patterns of music. And so somehow mathematics and telling stories using those patterns, using those formulas, was very important to me. And so when my mother said that Ramanujan was quite religious, he believed that everything had a meaning, all the mathematical formulas, then I started to search myself in a very simple, much more simplistic way for the narrative of these patterns. Because spirituality and mathematics are interwoven with each other in Indian classical music and dance.
They certainly were interwoven in Ramanujan's life.
Absolutely.
Let's bring in our expert now, Robin Wilson, who's an emeritus professor of pure mathematics at the Open University and has written about Ramanujan, also has a degree in music and has written on the history of mathematics. So you've actually visited Ramanujan's boyhood home. Have you been fascinated by him?
I always have, actually. I've always been interested in the theory of numbers, the theory of prime numbers, which was very much the subject, or one of the subjects, that Ramanujan was involved with. And I went to a conference in southern India, and it was fairly near Kumbakonam, which is where he grew up. And I'd always wanted to go there. And then my hosts suddenly said, would you like to go to Ramanujan's home? And I said, I'd love to. So they said, well, you get up at 5 o'clock tomorrow morning and we'll drive you there. And it was very, very exciting. We got to Kumbakonam. This is in the Madras Presidency, which is now Tamil Nadu. And we got there and we found the street, but we found a lot of difficulty finding the house. Eventually we did, and there's just a little portrait of Ramanujan above the home. It's a single-storey home, and we knocked on the door, and it was a very charming couple let us in and showed us around. But apart from that little portrait of him, that little photograph of him above the door, you would never have known it was anything special. Now I gather that it's actually a museum, a Ramanujan museum.
Akram, I want to explore in more detail the life of this man who changed the mathematical landscape. But before we do that, I want to do a little bit of the work, the maths itself. Now, it may be that we're just not going to be able to understand, but I think we should try. And even if we try and find we can't understand, in a way that helps illustrate the life. So, Robin, tell us a little bit about the main areas on which he dwelled.
Well, I mentioned the theory of numbers, the theory of prime numbers. A lot of what he did was very, very complicated indeed. I mean, that was the great thing about it. When he came up with his results, even the greatest mathematicians had never seen anything quite like it. In fact, Hardy, whom you mentioned at the beginning of the programme, said he received these results that Ramanujan sent to him. He said, these must be true because no one would have had the imagination to invent them. Most of his stuff would be far too difficult to explain on radio, and in fact it's far too difficult for many mathematicians to understand. But there are a couple of things that I might mention. One is that he came up with some completely bizarre formulae for pi. Now, pi is something we all met at school. It's the ratio of the circumference of a circle to the diameter. It's about 22 over 7, it's just a little bit less. And one of Ramanujan's results was that pi is, well, he came up with 99 squared over 2,206.
You're writing
square
this
root
down for
of
us.
2.
Yes.
I'm writing it down, yes.
Yes.
And 99 squared over 2206 root 2. Now, where that came from, heaven knows, but it gives pi to 6 decimal places. Even more amazing, he came up with 9 squared, that's 81, plus 19 squared over 22. Now, if you add those together and take the fourth root, that means you take the square root twice, amazingly, that gives you pi to 11 decimal places. Heaven knows how he thought of that.
Heaven does know, if anybody knows, Akram. This is one of the mysteries which I must say completely stumps me about him. He didn't appear to know whence he got the ideas, the theories that he got. It wasn't a matter of sitting down with building bricks and slowly building things up. Things appeared to have come to him.
Yeah, but
And
I mean,
nobody
he did
knew.
know, but he knew.
How?
God. He said it was divinity, it was divine. There's something about, that's something that really fascinated me about him, his spiritual side. And so Ramanujan, for me, his way of thinking is very interesting because there's something spiritual that is unexplainable. And that's why perhaps he couldn't justify it, because he's also, I think, if I'm correct, he's autodidact, he's self-taught.
Yes, he's largely self-taught. Most of his results from about the age of, I think he came across mathematics for the first time about the age of 11 or so. He read various books, he learnt from books, but then he started exploring, and from the age of 13 he was really creating his own mathematics.
Wow.
There was a goddess, Namagiri, whom
That's right.
he believed his family favoured, or who favoured his family.
This was the family deity,
Yes.
He always said that she was the inspiration. Sadly, when I was in Kumbakonam, I didn't actually have time to go to the temple where he went every day to pray to the goddess. But this, of course, led later on to difficulties because he got these results from on high and he never knew how he got them. And no one knew how he got them. And this caused a difficulty when he met formal mathematicians who wanted proofs. When he came to England later on, met Hardy, that was part of the conflict between them, which we'll probably come on to.
Yes, let's talk a little bit about his early life.
Yes.
And before I ask you, Robin, about some of the details of that, he was a Brahmin, and I wonder whether, Akram, you can explain what it is to be a Brahmin in the context in which he was born.
Well, I don't know so much about Brahmin, actually, to be honest with you, in all fairness. But it's a pretty high caste and usually highly educated.
Essentially a spiritual caste, so you
Very
don't
much
have to be
so.
rich, or you may not be
No.
rich, but you are somehow superior. Is
Yeah.
that right?
Yeah.
And how did that translate into his family and his upbringing, Robin?
Well, I don't think his parents were particularly high caste, but he went to these schools. They weren't particularly special schools, but it was his ability to do mathematics that suddenly people realised that there was something special there. A crucial moment actually occurred when he was age 16, because when he was 16 he came across a book, and this is a very famous part of the story, a book by G.S. Carr, an Englishman, A Synopsis of Elementary Results in Pure and Applied Mathematics. That was actually a major influence on his life, because it's a collection of something like 5,000 different results in mathematics, both very pure and very applied, and it was a very concise style. It was just the results. And looking at those, he obviously tried to prove them, and this is where I think it led him to his great career.
I'm trying to visualise this little and then growing boy, family who are intelligent but not particularly well born. Was it a close family, a loving family? What inspired in him the belief, do you think, Akram, that he could be?
From what I've read, that I heard that he's very close to his mother.
Yeah.
And mother was quite religious. And I think through that access he learnt a lot about religion, and probably his way of life and his way of thinking is influenced by his mother, which then influenced the way he perhaps thought about mathematics. I mean, his language is mathematics, how he communicates is through mathematics. But there's something very much about his mother, I think, in his work.
Did he know, Robin, that he was always going to be a mathematician? How did his career go from teenage years?
He was so fascinated with mathematics, he spent all his time doing it. In fact, at various stages in his career, when he was sort of 17 or 18, he went to a higher school, and he basically failed all his exams apart from mathematics because he just ignored all the other ones. So that's what stimulated him. The result was that he didn't get the advancement he should have done because he couldn't get to the school because he'd failed all his exams. But eventually, what he was producing, especially when he moved to Madras, what he was producing, he actually showed to some of the mathematicians. Once he had people to take him seriously, even some of them couldn't understand what he'd done because it was so way above anything they could do. But they actually realised that there was something very, very special here. And he had a few people that really helped him develop this. He wrote papers and so on, and that was his start.
And meanwhile, Ramanujan was constantly writing to famous mathematicians all over the world, wasn't he?
Yes, around 1912, 1913, his mathematics was advancing so much that he was encouraged by some of the Indian mathematicians in Madras to write to the English mathematicians. And he wrote to 3 or 4 of them. 1 or 2 were initially slightly encouraging, but said, well, you must produce proofs of these. 1 or 2 thought he was a crank and just returned his letters. But then the crucial thing was the letter that you started
I read
with.
out, yes.
Writing to G.H. Hardy, who was probably the most distinguished pure mathematician in England at the time, in fact, in the first half of the last century. And as I said, when he received it, Hardy looked at it and he thought, well, as I say, there's obviously something very, very special here, but I need to see the proofs. So he wrote back to Ramanujan and said, some of these results are well known, some of these results are not well known and probably not very important, but they look quite intriguing. And some of them really do look very, very important. I really want to see some proofs of these things.
Here is what G.H. Hardy himself wrote. The limitations of Ramanujan's knowledge were as startling as its profundity. Here was a man who could work out modular equations and theorems of complex multiplication to orders unheard of, whose mastery of continued fractions was, on the formal side at any rate, beyond that of any mathematician in the world. It was impossible to ask such a man to submit to systematic instruction, to try to learn mathematics from the beginning once more. On the other hand, there were things of which it was impossible that he would remain in ignorance. So I had to try to teach him, and in a measure I succeeded, though I obviously learnt from him much more than he learnt from me. Now that was after Hardy persuaded Ramanujan to come to Trinity College, Cambridge.
That's right. And in fact, at first, Ramanujan didn't want to go because if you're a Brahmin, you were not allowed to travel
overseas.
abroad. And that was really quite difficult. But apparently the story goes that his mother had a dream that the goddess said, yes, it's okay that he can go. And so he went in 1914. He went by boat. He arrived a month later, and he went to Trinity College, where he started working with Hardy. But as you say, the problem was that Hardy was very formal and had to be. He said, if you want to publish this stuff, we have to have the proofs. Whereas Ramanujan often didn't know how he got the results. I mean, later he learned how to prove things. But Hardy was very nervous about pushing him too much in the direction of formality in case it ruined his imagination.
Now, this is something that fascinates me and bewilders me. Akram, he doesn't appear to have started with any idea of the significance of proof. He didn't understand what proof was or why you had to prove. How could you be a mathematician, do you think, and have no concept of the idea of proof?
Well, I don't know. That's when you call a person a genius.
Yes.
You know, because they themselves don't know their caliber of, it's like Leonardo da Vinci, who was also autodidact. You know, he was self-taught, and those people are geniuses. That's why it's unexplainable how it came to them.
Knowing that something is so, not knowing how you know that it's so, not knowing where it came from, and not having any sort of systematic ability to prove that it's so.
You know, the way I look at it, I look at it a clash between two things when he met G.H. Hardy. Proof for me is kind of, in my way of looking at it, is linear. And his way of thinking is circular. What do I mean by that? There are two types of time. One type of time is linear, which is westernized, Christianized, industrial clock time.
Yes.
Man-made time. And then the other time is spiritual time, which is a spiral, vertical time. So one of them's horizontal and one of them's vertical, but it's circular. So the spiritual time is nature time, life and death time, things that don't have proof. It's ritualistic time. And I think there was a real clash. That's what fascinated me about Ramanujan much later. When I grew up, I again became fascinated with Ramanujan, was the clash between horizontal time and the vertical time, because there must have been something going on in him, thinking, why does he need to prove himself?
Yes, that's right. As I said, he got the intuition from above. But, of course, the two of them working together, and in the 5 years or so that Ramanujan was in Cambridge, they actually worked together as a team with Ramanujan's imagination, his intuition, together with Hardy's more formal training, and the two of them together produced these spectacular papers that they produced together.
Now, was it at this time he was working on his partition theory?
The partitions, well, as I say, it was only in a 5-year period, but
yes.
the partitions was something that he actually came to. Perhaps I can explain what partitions was about. I mean, one way of thinking about it is if I say to you, how many ways can you give change for £1 if you just have 5p, 10p and 20p pieces? And so that's it's a breaking up of £1 into, as I say, 5s, 10s
yes.
and 20s. You can also break up numbers. You take number 4. Now, you can break that up, well, there's 4, there's 3 plus 1, there's 2 plus 2, there's 2 plus 1 plus 1, and there's 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1. There are 5 ways of doing it. If you break up the number 5, you'll find there are 7 ways of doing it. If you take the number 6, you'll find there are 11 ways of doing it. If you take the number 100, how many ways are there? Well, in fact, it's over 190 million. But the question is, can you actually find a formula where if you give me a number, I can tell you how many ways there are to break it up, how many partitions there are of it? And this was a problem that had been around for 300 years, but no one had ever been able to solve that problem. And the amazing thing is they came up with a formula, and it was the most bizarre formula you can imagine. I mean, it involved pi, it involved square roots, it involved exponentials, it involved differential calculus, a whole lot of things which had no right to be there at all. And yet they came up with this result, which I still think is one of the greatest mathematical results of the 20th century.
You're listening to Great Lives on BBC Radio 4 with me, Matthew Parris. My guest, the choreographer Akram Khan, has chosen the mathematician Srinivasa Ramanujan. Our expert witness is Professor Robin Wilson. Ramanujan and Hardy worked together for 3 years, but in spring of 1917 he became ill.
He had, in fact, been ill right the way through his time in Cambridge, on and off. He eventually became very, very ill indeed. He got very depressed. He even tried to commit suicide on one occasion.
He threw himself, or tried to, underneath
That's right.
an underground train.
Yes, that's right. But eventually, he ended up in hospital, and there's a very famous story associated with this. Hardy was visiting Ramanujan in hospital, and was completely devastated about how ill Ramanujan was. And when he arrived, he couldn't really think of anything to say except that I arrived and my taxicab number was rather boring, a rather dull number, 1729. And Ramanujan's eyes lit up. He said, "No, you're wrong, Hardy. It's a very interesting number. It's the smallest number that can be written as the sum of two cubes in two ways." But the point is that 1729 is 1,000 and 729. This is 10 cubed plus 9 cubed. It's also 1721 plus 1, which is 12 cubed and 1 cubed. And as I said, that's the sort of thing that really motivated him. It's said that Ramanujan, every whole number was a personal friend to him. And so immediately, 1729, it clicked, and he said to Hardy what it meant to him.
The illness, it is a recurring theme through his short life. You don't think it might have been psychosomatic in some way, ripped from his beliefs, his environment, told that as a Brahmin he was now defiled because he had left India? I just wonder whether something was bugging him that...
I mean, as a guess, I think it's always psychological. Nothing is just purely physical or medical. I think psychologically it must have had a huge impact on him to feel homesick, being so close to his mother, being married, but not really spending much time with his wife. It must be
well, in fact, this was quite important because he used to write home. His mother and his wife didn't see eye to eye with each other.
I think we should just go back and explain the wife business. He had been betrothed to her when she was 9. Is that right?
9 or 10, that's right.
And he left her behind in India.
Yes.
Was it a real marriage?
Well, they weren't allowed to live together until she reached puberty, in other words, till she was about 12 or 13. But then they did spend some time together. But there's always the conflict between his wife and his mother. And of course, she was just a young teenager at the time. And when he then went to England, he used to write to her, but the letters never arrived because his mother sort of hid them away and also hid her letters to him. And so he got very, very depressed because he kept on writing to his wife and didn't hear back.
Take me through the last of his years at Cambridge. It was a terrible time to be there. It was the First World War. A lot of people had gone. He was cold. He couldn't eat properly. He was suffering from this awful illness. The work continued apace. And then he decided to go to India. Why?
He had, as you said, a very, very successful time in Cambridge. He got his what is now called a PhD, a degree by research, in 1916. He became a Fellow of the Royal Society, a Fellow of Trinity College, the first Indian ever to be so. So in 1918, all his results, especially through the partition results, they were widely accepted, widely praised, and he became an important figure. But by that time, the illness had really sort of settled in. And so, as I said, he then returned to Kumbakonam in 1919, quite ill. He was nursed by his wife, and he eventually died aged 32.
Let's listen to a clip of his wife speaking about him on his return. It's taken from the 1987 Channel 4 programme Equinox, Letters from an Indian Clerk.
He wouldn't talk to anyone who came to the house. It was always maths. Even then he didn't care about his meals, but would only do sums. He sent them to England. 4 days before he died, he was scribbling. He filled a box with papers, and there were more papers scattered around the bed. The papers went here and there and changed hands. I don't know where they went. For him, in this universe, maths was everything.
You're listening intently, Akram. Are you almost understanding her?
No, I mean, why I'm listening so intently is because I've never heard that. I've never heard her words before. It's fascinating. I mean, What keeps coming to my mind about Ramanujan is that even from what the wife is saying is partly, I mean, it's hard to explain why a genius is a genius, but there is one fundamental thing about geniuses. They have this utter obsession and love towards what they do. And in life and death, it's like what I always say, in life and death, you're continuously moving. In life, you're moving because your heart never stops, your lungs never stop. In death, your body continues to decompose. So you're constantly moving. And with these geniuses, they're constantly engaged, moving with the subject that they're in love with. And, even on his deathbed, what his wife was saying, that he was still scribbling mathematics.
She spoke about all these papers being put in boxes. What's happened to them, Robin?
After his death, he left behind his notebooks. And his notebooks are full of these results that he got, which Hardy and his colleagues found so difficult and so intriguing. And in fact, ever since then, mathematicians have struggled to understand these things, to prove these results, to understand what was going on in Ramanujan's mind. A lost notebook emerged not too long ago, and again, a whole lot of completely new results. And the result is that Ramanujan became a bit of a cult figure. There have been documentaries on him on television. There have been lots of plays about him, quite a few plays. There have been a couple of ballets featuring Ramanujan and his search for patterns and his life. And as I say, he has become probably one of the most, if not the most, intuitive mathematician of all time. As I say, he'd become a cult figure that we worship to this day.
Akram, a final question. I'm so far from understanding the mind of a mathematical genius that it's simply inconceivable that you could tell a person an apparently random number and he could intuit or deduce the kind of fact that he deduced about that taxi licence number. I mean, I can't run a 4-minute mile, but I once ran a 5-minute mile, and I can extrapolate from my own experience, in a way understand how somebody might just be a lot better than me at something that in an inferior way I can also do. But Ramanujan isn't like that. It's as though this man were a different species from me, not just a superior example of the same species. Can you learn to do this kind of thing? Could I, if I'd applied myself, or is it that goddess again? Is it really just genius?
I think it's just genius. I mean, talent can't be learnt. There are some things that, education, there is no training for. Some people are just very gifted, and some people have to work, but you can't work to get a gift. Gift you're given with.
Do you have a gift?
No, I'm still trying to look for one.
My thanks to Akram Khan for choosing the life of Ramanujan, and to Professor Robin Wilson for being our expert. Goodbye. Thank you for downloading this programme from Radio 4. There are some 250 other editions of Great Lives available on the Radio 4 website.